everyone, welcome to tonight's webinar on becoming an esports competitor. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Palmerston Council and the Australian Esports League. Before we begin, the AEL would like to acknowledge the HeyKatie people, the traditional landowners of the Palmerston region. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. My name is Domino and I'm your host for this evening. I'm joined by two very special guests for tonight. Our first guest is Daniel Russell, known as Doctor. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
And our second guest this evening is Jackson, known as HeyKatie. Welcome, Jackson.
Good to be here.
Now, just let me give you everyone a little bit of intro about these two people we have here this evening, just so you know a little bit of their background. So Daniel Russell, better known as Doctor in the esports world, started as a player in 2016, playing Overwatch competitively. He played in some of the top teams in Australia in Overwatch's early esports days. After about a year of being a player, he moved into coaching and casting. After about another year of coaching, he moved into management and is now the general manager for Warriors Esports. He has worked and travelled with teams internationally. Our second guest this evening, Jackson, better known as HeyKatie, is a competitive FPS player and streamer who's played at a top level since 2010. He has competed internationally in Europe and America multiple times. He has competed in TF2, Overwatch, Fortnite, and most recently Apex. He's represented Chiefs, Tempo Storm, and Atletico. He's currently competing in local Valorant tournaments as well as coaching players to help improve their individual gameplay. Now, I'm going to hand over to Doctor and HeyKatie in a second, and then I'm going to talk about becoming an esports competitor. But just so you know, at the end of tonight's session, we're going to have a Q&A section. So any questions you have throughout the entire seminar, throw them into the chat. We've got some mods who are going to be picking those up, and we're going to have them ready for the end. So at any point, just throw some questions in. And for now, I'm going to hand over to Daniel and HeyKatie.
Okie dokie. Becoming an esports competitor, how does that start? I think the very basics of it is you got to make that decision of going from casual to pro. And to you, Jackson, what do you think inspires that decision between going from you're a casual gamer, you're playing games a lot, what makes that decision to go to that next level?
Well, there's a huge number of factors, and first you have to ask if you even want to be a professional in the first place. The difference between a casual and a pro player is vast, and people don't quite realize it. A casual player is still able to compete in tournaments and sort of play at their own pace, just still treat it like a fun thing. A pro player really has to treat it like a job. Something that people don't realize a lot is that it's now a legitimate profession. You have to treat it like a job. There are deadlines you have to meet. There are commitments you have to make. The expectation of what makes an esports player and the reality of the work you have to put in is hugely different. So in terms of like what would make a candidate for teams, for myself personally, I think one thing that players in the current year of 2020 need to have a separate mentality to what we might have grown up in. What I might have grown up in back in the 2010s. Social media is a big part of it, and it's something that people don't quite realize yet, Doctor.
I definitely agree. And I think one of the things when you're trying to go between casual and pro is trying to figure out, how do I find out where I sit? Do I need am I mechanically good enough? That's probably the easiest question most players will be able to answer quite quickly. But the next part of that is, am I ready to be coached, let's say? Am I ready to work in a team environment consistently where you're playing with other teammates multiple hours a day?
Mm-hmm. And you are analyzing yourself constantly. You're like I said before, you're treating it like a job. And you also have to keep in mind, how do you make a name for yourself? How do you get yourself out there and figure out what you can provide as a service to an organization and what to expect from it.
Yeah, when you're starting up as a player, it's very easy to go through, and I've seen this quite a lot, is the mentality of just getting good at a game. That's not it. You've got to take it past that, and what value do you offer beyond just your pure mechanics? Social media presence especially. All organizations, large organizations, are going to want to more or less advertise around their roster, let's say. And that's the same with tournament organizers. They're going to be promoting players. So you have to be in a place yourself where you can comfortably sit in front of cameras, do interviews and things like that potentially.
But first thing I want to talk about is how do you make it? Like, what's the mindset going into trialing? Because we'll have a very different understanding of what you expect from a player as a manager and what I am to expect going into, because I've done many trials over time. The mindset of trialing and making it into a position where you can treat it like a job and you can make money is something that I think a lot of, especially younger people in the current generation, are missing a little bit. The right mindset is definitely the best way to set yourself up for future success. Personally, I'm a huge believer in setting yourself up in a way that you can, like I said before, with social media, things like that. It's very different now. You have to have a name for yourself because the organization wants to build a brand around you, and that has to be a huge part. You can't just be good at a game anymore unless you happen to be extremely exceptional, which maybe 0.001% of people are.
So when you're deciding if you're a candidate for team and things like that, what potentially be some red flags would you say when, let's say, you're entering in and you're going to join a player team where it's a bunch of you not competing under somebody else's brand? How do you find those players that you're going to consistently play with? What are you looking for in those players?
And this is where it all starts, right? This is where everything starts. You never start just like straight up to the organization, the structure, the management. That comes later. You really have to start out in the player team. A player team is a team of just a group of people that organize their own tournaments. They organize their own practice, things like that. Everyone's done them before. Everyone's had their own personal experience, but after having about 10 years of player team experience, there are a huge amount of things to do to set yourself apart and set yourself as an attractive prospect for an organization, and as well as red flags to avoid in terms of your own mentality and attitude, as well as the players around you, because especially in a team game, you're going to need to build yourself around a group of people that you can rely on and that creates a positive working environment. Something that Australia is very guilty of having is that things tend to fall apart quite quickly because we're so far behind in the international scene of esports. It's a very new thing for us. The player-led teams all seem to follow the same rhythm of trying to surround yourself with the best players possible, and try and be as mechanically skilled as possible. And then the moment they lose one tournament, they start saying, okay, who can we replace? What can we do differently? You see this, I've seen this for years in multiple games, and it's never worked out. So what I'm looking for when I'm trying to join a player-led team, and this applies to all skill levels, because you don't have to be the best player to join a player-led team. You don't have to be the best to move yourself up and get a name for yourself out there. Personally, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for people I can rely on, because that will factor in later. I'm looking for people who share the willingness to learn and the willingness to take criticism positively. And someone that wants to just improve themselves and not just show up for the same thing. You show up, practice 3 hours a night or something like that, go to bed, do the same thing over and over again. There's a lot of extracurricular work you need to do to sort of get to that next level.
Yeah, and I would say that organizations, when they're looking at players, you're not just looking for purely let's say the top fragger, top score leader in a game. You're also looking for a guy that you can bring onto your team for as long as possible. Typically, you're looking to pick up players for 6-12 months, ideally in the best circumstances. So you want to have a sustainable roster. So as long as you're going into with the right mentality, if organizations see that in a player, that you've got the mentality, I want to train, like you said, I'm coachable. I can look at my own game plan, critically analyze. Organizations are going to look at you and go, I love that, because I can put a coach, I can go get a coach, put that behind that player, and I know he'll stick around for as long as possible. And that's where they see value.
And I think that's a hugely important point to make at the moment, because as Australian esports is evolving and we're still catching up, but it's slowly. It will be something in the next few years that is just gonna that kind of mentality is gonna explode in popularity. And the people who get onto it now, that sort of train their mind into this mindset of, here's who I am, these are my skills, these are my weaknesses, I'm ready to get better, rather than I'm literally the best, or like if we're not doing well, it's someone else's fault. Like, who can I replace? Things like that. This is the people that treat it like everything is a learning experience are the people that are going to succeed in the next few years down the line.
I think what we should do very quickly is touch on. I've gone through all this. I've sat down and I've thought about this mentally. Where do I go? Where should I go as a starting player to find myself a player team? Where do I go to get involved and like start looking?
Well, it used to be back in the day. It used to be different individual games had their own forums. Some still do nowadays, but the main place from the experience of the games that I've played, and I imagine you would agree, is definitely Discord. There are gaming Discords for every single game. Not only are there communities to join, and this comes into finding a team and trialing for teams. There are gaming Discords, and then there are gaming Discords with a more competitive-oriented mindset. Often competitive gaming Discords, where that's where the people who are looking for group area sections of the Discord where you can find and meet like-minded people, and and mess around a bit, join a few groups, play a few pickup games with players that also want to improve, and then you'll run into a couple that you enjoy playing with, and you might see there being something to work with. The other one is probably Twitter, social media. Again, it's a huge thing. Everything runs on social media nowadays, so I think Twitter is where a lot of organizations or tournaments will advertise their teams. So it's definitely something that you need to look at if you're looking to enter tournaments with your team.
I definitely agree. I think one of the best places to start with is always find your game, find the competitive Discord community, and then when we were talking about social media before, if you've built yourself up a presence on social media, something like Twitter, players will post looking for team post there, and if you've built yourself up a name, organizations will actually notice it there as well. So a bit of a combination depending on where you sit, but I think the primary place everybody that's like looking to get involved is that whatever game you're in, find that pro or community Discord, and
they all have one. Any game with a vibrant competitive community has a competitive Discord. It's if you could type it into Google and it will probably pop up. That'd be the best way to do it, I think, in my opinion.
So yeah, you've found yourself a team, you've done an LFT, you've trialed for a team, now you're on a team. What's it like? What's it like starting up and getting involved in scrims, training, tournaments early on?
Well, there's a huge difference between a player-managed team and a professional team. From a player-managed team is very ragtag. You do it for the love of the game or to the desire to improve. It's a lot more of a chill environment with people that you'll start to meet as your friends, versus a professional team where it's much like on any professional sport. You are there. You are representing a brand. You are representing that brand's sponsors. You have results that you need to get. You'll have people like coaches, managers that require you to be present. And it sounds silly and it sounds ridiculous, but actually showing up and being there to practice for hours a day and making sure that your focus is on improving. Because if you don't get the results, or you don't succeed in the areas that the org requires of you, then it's very easy for that org to move on and find another team.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think at the end of the day, when you go from that player managed team to organization managed and run, your expectations kind of jump quite drastically. I think time commitment is most immediate one that affects players. The amount of time you're playing can spike quite drastically. You can be a player run team, you're doing 2 hours of scrims a day, only 3 days a week. Then you join a team, you're playing every weekend in a tournament, or every second week, you're doing 4 hours a day, 5 days a week up to, and then you're adding on top of VOD reviewing, looking back at your game plan, the coach sitting down with individual players potentially and analyzing their play and giving them feedback. So you kind of jump from, well, I would say the hobby to job sort of jump.
And this is a very important point to bring back to the first point is whether you actually want to be in the first place. So I don't think people realize that in the year of 2020, it has never been harder to be a competitive player than it has been here. The gaming has exploded in popularity. Competitive gaming is huge. which means there are more people trying to take up those spots. And if you're trying to commit yourself to one of the more popular competitive games where you can make a living out of it and you can compete and you can travel internationally, then those games are going to be full of people spending hours and hours a day for no money, that with the chance like that maybe they'll get to the point where they can travel internationally for an event.
And once you get on that team, there's always some other person chasing for your spot, is the way I like to put it.
Yeah, the constant.
Once
the
you get there,
need.
you don't just stay there. You've got to put in the work to stay at the top, because there's some like young kid coming up who's chasing your spot, and that's I think where a lot of people getting into esports now, young players trying to chase these high spots, and they can definitely chase down anybody that's currently sitting in any competitive team in almost any game.
Complacency is a huge danger.
Yes, I think that's actually complacency where you get there. I don't need to put in as much effort as I took to get here. You're as good as you are because of the effort you put in. You need to stay there with just as much. Talking about, if we want to touch on age briefly, I think different ages in different games, and you've got a lot of young players coming up. The one thing you'll find when you go from the casual to pro is there are some barriers of entry in regards to potentially being too young. And that can be typically based around the game you're playing and the rating of that game. Tournament organizers putting restrictions on the minimum age requirement to play in their events. So Overwatch League, I think it's 18.
Because they have to, if they want to use media for it, then they can't use a minor, which is unfortunate, as well as player-run teams favoring people that are above 18. Yeah,
I think that's definitely a big thing to look at, and there are ways to work around it. But yeah, I think the social media presence of, they're going to want to take a photo of you and they're going to want to put it up on their ad for whatever sponsor that they're working with. And the younger you get, the more and more restrictions you run into, especially in Australia as well. Anything else we want to touch on what it's like to be part of a team?
I would say, aside from the fact that, especially once you've made it and once you are competing for prizes or traveling or things like that, you are now a public persona. You have to be. If you don't want to be a public persona, then you're going to struggle a lot more. You're representing a brand. The higher you get, the more. And on top of that, the more of an attractive personality and presence you have in that gaming world, the more attractive you are to an organization.
Yeah, definitely. I would have to agree. I've actually run into players in the past that are very anti social media presence, and I've had to work with them and explain to them, we can work around that and things like that. But at the end of the day, long term, if they want to pursue it as a career, there is going to be a point where they'll hit where they will, the organization will pick them up and say, you have to, there's no choice, or they just won't get acquired by a larger organization.
And something that I think you would have a very strong opinion on is that those people who, a lot of younger people think that once you're the best, then that's all that requires. If you just keep pushing yourself and you just want to be the best possible, the best player is not necessarily what the organization wants. If you're the best in the world at your game, let's say you're the best in the world at Counter-Strike or something like that, if your attitude is so poor and you're so hard to work with, then an organization is going to have second thoughts about picking you up. You have to be attractive in your mentality and your ability to learn and work with the organization to actually be considered as a legitimate prospect. Doesn't matter how good you are at aiming.
I think everybody's like, you're the best in the world. There's some other person out there trying to get your spot, and they'll put in the effort to be more presentable to an organization, I think. So you kind of got to remember, what value do I bring there? And we're talking about value you bring, expectations and things like that. What are the expectations once you make that leap from... Actually, I think we should also talk about expectations on a player-run team as well. Expectations from the tournament organizers and organizations that are picking up these teams and putting their players into these events.
Expectations from a player-run team.
What would your expectations be of your other... like the other people you're playing with? Like, how do you manage that expectation between where there's no authority in a sense above you to help kind of stabilize that system, where at any time anybody can leave. How do you work around that?
Well, the simple fact is that you're right. It's unstable. You're not making money to be to treat it like a job at the time in a player-run team. Usually, at the end of the day, it's a stepping stone, right? Everyone has to treat a player-run team as a stepping stone to a greater goal. It's not selfish to be looking out for yourself in that regard, because the fact is that there are, in whatever game you're playing, these are specific to team games, not to solo games, but there are everyone that is not you is something that you can't really control. But they can help you, and they can elevate you as a player. So it's the same thing. Take in as much as you possibly can from as many people as possible, and use that to better yourself as a prospect. That's the way I'd look at it. A player-run team is a stepping stone to something greater.
Yeah, and then you step up and you make it into these large events where you've got invite events. It's not a qualifier or something like that, or potentially an event has a lower tier qualifier, but they're going around and picking and choosing these teams that they're going to invite to these events. And that's where your expectations kind of jump a lot. And that's where time investment as well will jump quite drastically. The expectations of a tournament organizer, for example, hosting a LAN event where they're going to be bringing 8 teams, 4 teams, however many teams to a local venue, and then hosting however many tournament matches that they're going to run, their expectations of you and professionalism required jump quite drastically. You're not allowed to be late. If you're late, you can suffer penalties in matches quite quickly. Social media, they're going to require interviews and such things like that, so that they can chuck that up in halftime breaks or things like that. You've also got, I think tournament organizers, one of the other big ones to remember is tournament rules. The lower tier event that you're playing in probably is going to be a little bit looser in the way they run an event, and they won't chase you around every little thing. As you go up, you're going to end up signing rule sets to govern how you play in these events, and you've got to make sure you follow those, because if you get that high, the big thing that can mess you up is if you break rules in an event, and usually if you're at that level, there's not much else around. There is that event for your game. You don't want to get kicked out and removed from these events. So I think that's one of the big things is professionalism at that level. You need to be ready for that, ready for the expectations. You might be required to travel. How long is that going to be for? Be ready to travel to a LAN event eventually. Not in the current environment, unfortunately, but eventually we'll get back to those. And the expectations of the organization on you when they're sending you to these events, right? If they're sending these events, they do actually also, once again, as you addressed earlier, expectations on results. You need to be able to perform under pressure. And I think that's one thing that you don't get experience along on the way. You get there and then bang, you're in. You're at a LAN. You're competing on a stage in front of a live audience. There's not much build up to that. And I think one of the things is working with like your own mentality to put yourself in a place where you're able to sit down and get into the game and kind of ignore what's going around. Or I know some players that kind of ride the hype of the crowd as well. So I've seen drastically different, mentalities regarding that.
Just to touch up on the treating on the tournament expectations and rule sets, is that it all circles back to the same thing. Is that when you want to be a pro gamer, it is a job. It's a job, and a tournament is an extension of the job that you've chosen. Professionalism is huge. You don't show up to work in casual clothes. You show up to work ready to do what is required of you, and you have to maintain a level of ability to perform that task. Otherwise, you get replaced. And any competition worth its salt, even the smaller ones in the Australian region, will have very strict policies on what you are and aren't allowed to say, as well as how you are to behave during the tournament. And the amount of people that still fail to understand this or manage to break those rules is just absolutely staggering. Everything you do and everything you say, the way you behave yourself, it will come back. The internet never forgets, and it's something that you need to keep in mind. If you want to live your life and to have a job that revolves exclusively around the internet, you need to treat it like this is your workplace. You know, it's your workstation, that you don't throw rubbish around.
Yeah, you like the uniform thing. You will have a uniform at these events. They will be chucking a jersey on you with their branded sponsors on you, right? That's how they're fulfilling their requirements of whatever sponsorship deal they have. You've got to respect that when you're walking around and potentially interacting with fans, you're wearing somebody else's brand. And yeah, in the public domain, everything you say stays there. You can't get rid of it. You got to make sure inside and outside events you're in, events can remove you from their tournament if they don't like how you act in a public space. That really just depends on the organizer and the rule set that they present. I think that's anything else about tournament organizers and organization teams' expectations that you think we should touch on?
I think that it is something that you do learn as time goes on. It's something that, like, once you achieve it, then once you get to that point when you're playing under an organization representing a brand, there are people like Daniel that are there to assist the younger people in terms of like what is expected of them. So it's something to consider for sure, but without getting too deep into it, because we could talk about it for 5 hours if we wanted to. Once you make it there are people in place to help you understand.
Yeah, there'll be an entire organization around you to help with that. Let's briefly talk about large organizations are getting noticed by them. How do you go out there and you're in a player-run team? How do you change it from that hobby to career? You're playing in these weekly events, let's say. What would your process be from a player side? What do you think gets you noticed the most in terms of potentially getting headhunted instead of running around trying to
run around through the trial process?
Yeah, because that can take who knows how long, and you could be up against so many other players. How do you get headhunted from your perspective?
Well, back in the day, it used to be very different. To you were directly tied to your performance, and that was it. Really, there was nothing else there were no other expectations to reach. In the current year, your online presence is everything. A player is far more attractive if they have an online presence. If they're marketable, you know, if they things like streaming, video, YouTube, or like just like posting on even like, you know, message boards, things like that, like even like Reddit, things like that. Any extra reach you have is insanely attractive to an organization, because the simple fact the organization wants you for marketability, and results is a form of marketability, but online presence and like your ability to be attractive to an organization is very much dependent on what they get out of you as a player, not just your skill.
Yeah, I would say the marketability is a great point that you pointed out. At the end of the day, one team wins. Everybody else came second, third, or fourth. An organization can't, like, unless they're going out and they're picking up the best single team, they can't just run around, and not every organization can get that. They want to be able to see, you know, you're streaming in front of your own viewership and things like that. Getting your name out in that way means that they won't just get you because you're the single best player. They know that when you're not playing in an event and there's a break between seasons, you can be chucked on they'll be streaming, and they can put their branding through that avenue.
Yeah, it's expectations versus reality, because realistically everyone wants to be the best, but only a few people are going to be the best. Chances are nobody listening to us right now is going to reach the point where they are literally the best at anything. I certainly never was. The dependency on alternative avenues to make yourself as attractive as possible is such a huge factor. Something that never existed before, but is just so important now, because being the best does not cut it anymore. It used to cut it, but it doesn't anymore.
Yeah, I think you're not going to be, look at the Fortnite World Cup. Only one person wins that insane X million. I don't even know how much it was anymore. X $1 million.
Too much.
Everybody else after that, does anybody remember the names of third, fourth place? If they've got a big social media presence, some of them can sometimes be more popular than a first place person, because the personality of that person, people want to go and they want to support that team. It's like if you're supporting a traditional sporting team. Every team has massive amounts of fans that will go there and watch every single game. You kind of want to try and work towards that as an individual player, because if you're a player that has a following, an organization will find you, right? As long as you are at least of a somewhat high skill level, you're competing up there amongst the best, not necessarily the best, they will go and pick you up for their team because they know great personality. I can chuck him in a branded ad of some variety. I can promote products on him, things like that. Because at the end of the day, that's where the funding comes from.
Mm. Yeah, and it's also because once it gets to that the organizational level, that's where the player manager steps in, and they're the ones that make sure that that player is surrounded by the right people. The player created teams are very different. It's sort of everyone for themselves, but you can swing the odds in your favor by surrounding yourself with the right people with the right attitude. But in terms of an organization, that's where people like Daniel are there to make sure that the atmosphere is as good as possible and the team has the best possible chance to win.
I think we've kind of addressed all of the points that we had down there. Domino?
Sorry, everybody, just realized my mic was muted there. So we'll get into some of the questions. Now, we've had a fair few come in from the pre-registrations. We've also had a few come in during the webinar. So if you have some, do feel free to throw more in, but we'll start with the first question we received. So one moment. Okay. We've had a question from Brody. Now, I'm going to mention Brody's age because it is relevant to the question. So Brody, age 10, asks, am I too young?
Age 10?
Is there games that maybe is there Pokemon ones? I'm not even sure. Is there young?
There is a if there's a game, there's a tournament, there is a scene. That's a tough one.
I will say that age, it is a very young age. You will be limited in what you're able to actually compete in. Some, like you said, there are some tournaments that are specifically designed for younger people. And you mentioned Pokemon. I do know that there is a Pokemon tournament that is for younger. That's for a younger audience. I think it's like 10 and under. So, but in terms of an FPS or an online FPS, you might have to wait a few years. But instead of saying, okay, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna compete right now, you can say, all right, look, I'm very young. I have an idea of where I want to be, and I'm gonna spend the next few years just working towards getting to that point. And then once you hit the right age, which I think 16 is probably the minimum age that an organization might consider you picking up, and that would probably be a stretch, probably be closer to 18. But you've got so many years of experience now of mastering yourself as a player and as a person that take for me, for example, I didn't start playing till much later. I would have loved to have started when I was 10 years old, because that's so much that you've got the whole world ahead of you. You've got so much time to set yourself up for future success. So I think, in my opinion, at that age, I would definitely be looking towards the future, not so much straight away.
I'd say focus on making sure you're enjoying the games. I think that's would be my thing at that age. Make sure you're finding a game that you like and enjoy and having fun with. Organizations will definitely 16. They would be making pretty big exceptions if they were going below 16.
I do want to step in, sorry to interrupt, but I do want to say competing and being a professional player it's very few people get to that point. You've got a very small chance of making it, even if you are good enough. And spending your entire schooling years, especially with the goal of being a professional player in the future, is you can do that, but you have to make sure that you're measuring expectations. You're saying, okay, I'd like to do this, but I have to do it on the side because if you waste your schooling years, then you're hoping for something that might just not end up happening. So you definitely have to treat it as something that you're doing on the side while you're getting your education.
A hobby as you're still in school. 16 is why I say like there's exceptions that are added, and 18, as you said before, is most people are either finishing school at that point, and organizations themselves won't want to interrupt somebody's learning as they're going along to just get them in for who knows how long. That's why they'll typically wait that long. But you can go and join events just to see what it's like, to have some fun, and just try it out. Probably a Mario Kart event for like Mario Kart, Super Smash. Go watch them. Watch games. See what you like. Go from there.
See if there's like some local tournaments for younger age groups and things like that you can get involved in. Maybe
ask your parents.
Ask your parents, yes. Ask your parents to help find some things. Okay, Jack has asked, and I feel like you probably have touched on this, so just ask if there's any more extra points to add to this, is how do I make this into a career? Anything extra? Because you have sort of talked about that broadly, sort of, I guess, how they can get that, but is there anything else you'd like to add about this becoming your actual career, being an esports player?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind, and just as a I'm trying to find the word, but to preface this, always have a backup plan. Just like if you were to say, I'm going to become a world-class soccer player, you need to have a backup plan, because it's much like becoming a world-class athlete. It's a lot of people will try, and only some will actually get there. So how do you turn? So that's just to say, because I don't want people going off and be like, yeah, I'm going to do this, and then if it doesn't work out, I'll be like, Jackson, why'd you tell me that? But in terms of, what was the question again? Sorry, how do you turn it into a career?
Yeah. How do you become a professional esports player full time? I guess. How is it your job?
Well, we sort of touched. We did touch on it a fair bit during the webinar, but in terms of making the transition from someone that just makes it to just playing and competing in tournaments, because tournaments, especially the lower level tournaments, they're open to everybody. The best way to get noticed is competing in those tournaments and then seeing how you go, measuring your expectations, factoring your skill level. Okay, let's say you play one tournament and you place 10th. Okay, that's fine. Then you go out, you look for resources and things like that. People who are willing to help coach you, and they're out there, trust me. People who are willing to help you step up your game. Nobody is born to be amazing at video games. It's a learned skill and something that some people pick up easier than others, but anyone can do it. And I think once you manage your expectations and you realize where you place, then you work on improvement, work on getting yourself to a higher level. The best way to turn it from a player run, just a fun thing, into a career is you got to start with some marketability, and the easiest way to start with marketability and getting noticed is a strong performance in a tournament.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I was going to say the marketability side of things. You go compete in every event. If you want to make it a career and give it a go, play in every event you can and do your best in them. Work with your team to get the highest placement you can. Talk about your games. Make sure you're streaming and things like that. Make sure you're trying to get yourself noticed. And if any bigger team puts out, they're looking for more players, looking to trial people, just put your hat in the ring.
Yep.
Try
Keep
and
doing it.
Take every opportunity is the way I'd like to put it.
It's like sorry to interrupt again, but it's like when you're looking for a part-time job, every place you put your name down will not take you, but one of them or two of them eventually will. It's a trial thing. You have to be willing to fail to succeed, and you have to treat everything like a learning experience. Something people that still, especially the younger kids that are still growing up today and growing up in the esports scene, treat anything that isn't first as as a really bad thing that is something you should just completely avoid entirely. The thing is, you can learn something from every possible situation. You come 10th, great. You've got a wealth of information on your performance, on your play, on your team that you can analyze yourself. You can analyze with your team. You can get assistance from other people to improve, and look at it like that rather than oh no, I'm only 10th, I suck, or my team sucks, or something like that. You've got to have that right. They've got to have that mentality to climb the ranks. Some people start at the top. Very few people do, but some people don't. Most people start in the middle, and that's fine because those middle players with the right mentality will become better than those people who are at the top and that we just had everything handed to them and thought, oh, I don't have to do anything. I'm just going to be amazing. The hardest worker is always the one that gets the furthest.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Working hard and, as I was saying before, hat in the ring to everything you can, every trial, everything like that. I think that pointing out like every part-time job, you don't just go, oh, I'm going to get that part-time job. It's like, I'm going to just hand in 10 resumes and go from there. I'm going to go join every trial I see an opportunity to go in and join. I'm going to play every event I can because that's how I'm going to get noticed. And if you pop off or things like that, maybe another player-run team might come and approach you and say, hey, we've lost a player from our roster. We'd like to pick you up, or something like that that's placing higher than you and things like that. It's, once again, getting your name out there through whatever means you can, and that's either social media or events, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll move on to our next question. This may be a little bit more directed at you, this one, Daniel. Matthew has asked, can you run through the process of becoming an esports team and how it all works so I can understand what I'm in for if I jump off the esports cliff? So I'm getting to understand that this is about actually building a team.
Okay.
Which could be, it's a lot of that's a big question. There's a lot involved.
Big question.
Some basic
so
points,
the question
maybe?
was about building a team and potentially running it. Would that sort of be?
Yeah, so there's the process of becoming an esports team. So I guess finding players, maybe entering tournaments. There is a fair bit involved.
Becoming an esports team, the first thing you have to do is make a brand, right? Brand yourself. Who are you, right? What's your team name? What's your logo? You've got to build a brand first, because if you don't, there's nothing to tie your performance to and things like that. And then from there, you got to be at the same time be approaching a roster as well as players at the same time. Roster and sponsors at the same time and things like that, because you want to transition from funding to, you need that funding to then pick up as good a players as you possibly can, and the ones that are marketable for you to then meet your requirements from a sponsor, let's say. I think there's so much more involved in that as well.
It is quite a large question.
Like building relations and just finding a game and an event that you want to start with and trying to get involved in that. And then from there, you can start taking those next steps. I think the best place to start realistically is to find a team to work with and then go from there. It all depends also how much capital you have behind you to build that team as well. That can drastically change how you approach that as well. If you have the capital, you can make a brand, get a roster, enter a tournament in one step, potentially, right? The big thing is that you don't want to rush picking up a roster, I'd say, is the biggest thing. Don't just go, oh, that's the best team right now that played an event. I'm going to pick them up. And then in 2 weeks, they're like, I don't like this guy on the team. I don't like this guy. Be very careful in the selection of your roster, I think, would be something you really pay attention to, because you don't want them to leave or not want to play with each other after a couple of weeks. So, yeah, I think that covers it. Branding and roster sort of is like where you start.
Yeah, something you mentioned as well is going and working with a team. So something you both mentioned when you guys were talking about esports in general was the fact that there's Discords and there's sections where you can looking for teams and teams are looking for players and things like that. It's also probably worth noting that in those sections there are teams looking for managers. So if you like a game and you want some team experience and you want to do the management side of it, there's actually the possibility for that. So you could go and work with a team and learn the ins and outs a little bit first before potentially building a team.
Don't dive headfirst with no idea what's going on. You definitely want to go in, see. I think that's actually a very good idea. Like, go in and find teams that are looking for either like managers, coaches, or organizations
some way to help
represent.
yeah.
Usually, go in
even
and just start with them, and then work out. Oh, this is how it works, because there's a lot of like just little things that this is how it works, and it's not like other traditional forms of business that are a little bit janky, I'd say.
Well, you could even just approach teams as well. Most player-run teams would jump at the chance to have someone help them out with management because they're just doing it all themselves. So, approaching other teams or player-run teams is definitely a good way. And then you can treat it all as experience. At the end of the day, experience is key. You have to gain as much as you possibly can to set yourself up for future success.
On to the next question. This might be a bit of a hard question. I don't know if you'll actually be able to put a number on it, but Amanda has asked, what percentage of players become professionals? Don't know if any of us would be able to actually put a number on it, but okay. Ballpark, what do you think?
I can put a percentage on it,
okay.
In a sense. You're looking at, in most games, you've got a tiered system of a ranked ladder, right? You've got, let's say, gold, silver, bronze, silver, gold, platinum, diamond master, and grandmaster. That's like the Overwatch system. Only, I can't remember the exact percentage. It's like 1% of players make grandmaster. It might be less than that. It might be a little bit more. Of those grandmaster players, you're talking like a number that you count how many teams are in the pro scene, and then you go how many players on each team, and that's how many pro players there are. So if there's 10 teams with 5 on it, that's 50 pro players in a region. It is a very small number at the absolute top. You take one step down from that, and it explodes in numbers, right? In that open player-run team system, that's when everybody's trying to make that next step. A number.
Less than 1% would be my.
I was going to say
very small.
0.1% of players.
As you mentioned earlier, it's a little bit like an athlete. It's like a sports professional athlete. That is also a small number, and this is...
How many Usain Bolts are out there?
Yeah, the more popular your sport and game is, the more people there are out gunning for you. The answer would be, less than 1%, maybe less than 0.5%. In terms of global players, that is. In terms of people that actively compete, it might be a little bit different. It also depends on the game. You have to keep in mind that some games are far more not welcoming, but tiered for a tier 2/tier 3 scene below the tier 1 scene than other games are. So like a game that to put it to example, mate, let's use Overwatch again. There's a tier 1 scene, there's a tier 2 scene, and then there's not really much beyond that, right? So that game is okay. That game is a little bit more, I guess, maybe a little bit more attractive to someone that wants to build themselves up over time because there's still a tier 2 scene. You don't need to be the very best. Take a fighting game or something like that, where the money is not quite as significant. If you're not a top 15 player, then you're probably making nothing.
There are a lot of...
I think actually a good way to put it was how many people play club football, right? How many people play club football? And of those teams, out of let's say 5 teams, 1 or 2 players will get picked up out of those teams to move up to that next level that's still before that top tier of play, right? It's very much similar in terms of traditional sporting where it is the peak players that get picked up. And that's a very small percentage of the players that are still playing it potentially for a huge amount, like investing a lot of time, like they're playing club soccer or club rugby every weekend or something like that, and they're training X number of days a week. Not that many people get taken to that next step in reality. That's just the reality of it, I'd have to say.
The benefit of gaming and esports is that outside of a very few rare circumstances, anybody can do it. If you live your whole life saying I want to be a professional basketball player, I'm sorry, but you're 4'10", like you have no chance. That's bad luck. Doesn't matter how hard you try. If you want to be a professional gamer, anyone can be the best. Anyone can get to a high level. It will just take a lot more work for some people than it will others. There's a lot of work involved anyway, but the benefit is that if you do work hard enough, I would have faith that you would make it.
Yeah.
Okay, on to our next question. Logan has asked, how would you turn somebody who's below average at video games into a professional? This is what Jackson's doing at the moment. Coaching.
the simple, and I imagine that Daniel can give a great coaching advice as well. Much like what we spoke about in terms of the what we were talking about during the whole webinar about how to get better, improve yourself, measure your expectations. Okay, you're looking at it and you're saying you're a below average player. Okay, that's completely fine. You're allowed to be. That doesn't mean anything. Of all the competitive games I've seen, usually I start out quite good and then I sort of peter off just because I don't take the game as seriously anymore. I just fall out of love with it. I've seen players who I would say are below average at the start that now made it further than I ever did, just because they put in the work. In terms of turning someone into someone that's below average, like I said before, it's a ladder to climb, right? Like some people start out on the top of the ladder, some people start out below the ladder. You're starting out a little bit lower, but so there's going to be a little bit more to climb, but it's not impossible. You're still capable of it. You have to seek out people that will help you. They're out there, like I said, they are out there. I'm one of them. And you need to fight with depending on what game you want to play, of course. And you need to manage your expectations and just open your mind to a willingness to take in as much information as possible. If you have to land face first in the dirt from competing and practicing, that's okay. The difference between someone who is stuck in a low rank and someone who is also in that rank, they're both capable of getting out. One will get out because they say, I'm in this rank because I'm doing things fundamentally wrong. I'm going to practice. I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to practice. Just like you would any traditional sport. Whereas the other person is going to sit there and say, game sucks, not my fault. They're not going to look at themselves. They're not going to analyze what they're trying to do, and they're just going to sit there and they're going to be stuck there. You have to open your mind, take in all the information you possibly can, look at yourself, look at down to like the very atoms of what you're doing in every single in the game that you're trying to succeed in. Look at what you're doing. Ask yourself, or ask someone that a coach or someone that gives coaching, what am I doing wrong? Because like any self-analysis is great, but often the person can't see the mistakes they're making, and it becomes a lot more apparent for somebody else to look at it than it would having that person. The more criticism you get and the more advice you can get, the easier it will be for you to climb that ladder.
And on the idea of being able to self-analyze is great. To find other people that will analyze your gameplay, there are teams in every game that are below average, right? Join one of them. Join a team that's close to your rank in whatever game you're playing, and start there, and then look at, okay, these are people all of the same skill as me. They're going to give you feedback, and be open to that feedback is the biggest thing. Don't be high and mighty going, I'm slightly better in the rank ladder than this guy. Be open to feedback and analyzing things post-play to then work on improvement. And like everything Jackson said just there, I think the easiest way to make that leap from average to starting to improve to go up is to find either a group or a team around the same skill as you, and then work from there. That's one way of at least starting that journey, I'd say. Don't just grind ranked alone and things like that. Grind in a way that is going to give feedback and allow you to improve.
And don't give up either. Some people can be so quick to give up. They'll get frustrated. They'll get gaming and improving at gaming and climbing out of that the skill bracket that you want to be in to get to where you do want to get in is hard. It's really difficult. It's really time consuming. But the benefit is that anyone can do it. And the reason why I say that with such confidence is I've seen it happen so many times. You just need to have the right mentality and the right mindset to do it.
All right. Our next question has asked, is age a barrier? Now, we talked about age from a younger perspective, but what about as people start to get older, 30s, 40s? Is there an age where people stop playing, or are there older esports players?
What are you getting at?
I got the thing about age.
Bradley has asked this question, is age a barrier?
Not really, from my point of view, to some extent, right? I think if a game lasts a long time, and I like to look at Counter-Strike Global Offensive or Source as the best example of this, some of the best players in that game are well and truly above the average you will see of players, say, in something like a game as young as Overwatch, let's say. I think newer games sort of will always lower the average play, but the longer the game lasts, the older and older you'll see players get in that game because experience shines through over mechanics eventually. It takes a while. And mentality, yeah. That actually, mentality is a huge thing. A young player that goes in guns blazing and then burns out versus a guy who's been doing it for 5 years. Barrier to entry, if you haven't started at an older age, I think that could... An unfortunate barrier that's more around people's perception than it is a reality. I think people's perception of picking up an older player that started later is more the barrier than the reality of you still can get just as good as some 16 or 18-year-old player with crazy mechanics. You just got to put the time and effort in to get there.
It's a similar thing to the whole starting at a lower skill level. Age is something that's very misunderstood in terms of esports. It's very popular opinion that the younger you are, the better it is. In some cases, that can be true. Like Daniel said with Counter-Strike, most of those players are some mid-30s, like 30s, late 20s. They're top of the world at an incredibly competitive game. But the example I like to give is combat sports, where the difference between someone staring at the lights and someone not staring at the lights, these people are fighting or competing for money that is just absurdly huge. And you've got people who are the top of the world. They've been doing it their whole life, and they're about 38 or something ridiculous like that. So to say that the older people, like, they can't keep up with the muscle memory or like hand-eye coordination, their reaction times are too low. Like, I can guarantee their reaction times, that kid's reaction times aren't even close to as good as some of the people that are professional athletes. And that's kind of where my point of mentality, practice, conditioning yourself, and health as well. Health is a big one, and it's something that we as gamers, sort of like, the stigma is that it's a very unhealthy environment, which it can be because, you know, you're sort of sitting at your computer for extended periods of time. It's something that is, and it's something that that bigger organizations now are bringing in sports nutritionists, and they're having people come in that with experience on giving the player a healthier body as well, which gives you a healthier mind at the end of the day. Now we're getting into the psychology of it, but age as a barrier is not really true. I would say that there's no real reason to think that someone who is 30 years old has less of a chance than someone who is 18, other than the fact that 18-year-old might be in a better position financially in terms of their living or job situation, that they might be able to spend more time practicing and playing the game than someone who is already into a different career.
I think the barrier is not so much the reality of it, as I said before. It's just the way people look at it, like, oh, you're older, we don't want to pick up an older player. I think while you touched on health there, I think I want to briefly touch on health of a player. When you get to that top level as an organization, you want to be making sure your players are healthy and things like that, because I think the gamers do overlook it, and they don't understand that it is actually a really big part of being a professional player. Because if you're not healthy, it legitimately will affect people's gameplay.
Healthy in body and mind as well.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to briefly just point that out. Like, it is, make sure if you're gaming a lot, like, leave your computer when you need to. Set up rest times. Make sure you're exercising. Make sure you're eating healthy. All these things. When you get into a big organization, if they see you're just sitting at the computer all day, every day, they're going to go, oh, that guy's going to potentially get actual problems like RSI or something in their wrist, something like that, which they'll go, oh, am I going to lose this player in 6 months to something like that? You know,
I've seen people who have grinded games out to such an extent, people that I know personally that are late teens, early 20s, and they have wrist problems already just because they didn't take care of themselves. They just spent so much time practicing. You have to take care of yourself to set yourself up for the future. Like what happens if you become the best player and you've made it, you've finally made it, and then you've got some crippling injury that you can't handle. Some games have it more than others. I know Smash Melee has the players that play that for extended periods of time have terrible hand problems because of the requirement of how much you're expected to practice and without taking proper care of yourself, it can lead to some serious to huge permanent injuries later down the line that are far more important. So to come back to it, like, because we went off on a bit of a tangent there, but the whole question was
just a little bit.
how significant is age? I don't think it's very significant at all. And I say that as someone that would be older than most competitive gamers nowadays. But age is something that is brought up a fair bit, but doesn't really have any legitimate scientific background to it. The benefit you have with a young player, okay, they've got more time to improve. They might be able to dedicate more. Is great. Then you've got the benefit of the older player who is a bit more seasoned and they're a bit more level-headed. They don't have that aggressive, like I have to be the best sort of mentality. They have their expectations are a lot more measured because they have more life experience, and that is a huge factor that people just overlook a lot of the time. But an organization will not overlook that.
Okay. Now I am going to make a note of the next question, but you guys actually already did answer this, but just acknowledging it. Cooper asked about if pro players are most people born with talent, or can you practice or train to be one of the best? You did already mention this, HeyKatie, that you can train. It's not that people are just born with it. Some people might be better skilled at it, but there is the option to people can train and work at it. So we'll move on to the next question. Just want to acknowledge that one did get asked. Next question has been asked, where is the best place to get coaching that isn't too costly? And they've specifically referenced League of Legends.
Okay, League of Legends.
I don't know if either of you have...
Not a game I've competed with, but I do know people that do coaching in League of Legends. Some of it is, I believe a fair bit of it is pay. And League of Legends is a pretty good game in that it's got a very healthy competitive scene. It might take a little bit of researching. It would be out there. I don't know off the top of my head just because I've never competed in League. I've just only played it casually. But I know people do. I know for a fact because my housemate used to coach League of Legends for free. So they are definitely out there. It would just take a little bit of research. And off the top of my head, specifically to League of Legends, at least, I don't actually know. But what I can say is that it does exist because I've seen it.
I would be certain that there is a person out there that is either really high rated or player or coach on a team that makes content about learning League of Legends heroes or the competitive scene. Go watch like tournament play, I think is one place, and then go find people that are making content about the game, right? Somebody that's taking other lower rated players or high rated players, looking at their gameplay and giving that person feedback. You may not be able to say afford to send in your own stuff. Some people do it for free, some people do it paid. Find somebody else that's doing that, maybe a person that's doing paid, and just watch their content that they make around that training and find relevant stuff to you. I think that's the only way I can think of it.
Yeah, YouTube has a wealth of content. There are so many content creators there are content creators in every single competitive game that specifically, like Daniel said, centralize their content around learning and teaching new players because people want to learn, just like you. People want to learn how to improve, and the benefit to picking a game like League of Legends is there is a wealth of content out there because it's such a popular game and it's got such a storied history now. It's one of the older competitive games that's still around and still pretty much in its prime. The YouTube guides, things like that, there will be heaps out there on League of Legends for every single character, for every single lane, for everything. And that's where I'd go. And then if you want a more personalized experience, that's where you might have to do a little bit more deep searching for free coaching, but there would definitely be paid coaching for reasonable prices where they would specifically sit down with you and analyze your skill set and what you want to improve on.
And not always, but typically if you are paying and depending on the background of that person, the higher up people, the higher up coaches and players will be putting paid services there. And that's where you'll get the best quality potentially as well, realistically. The best quality potentially will just come from the paid service. If you can't, just look around YouTube. I guarantee it's League of Legends, like you said. It is an established game. It's been around so long. There will be something there for you to learn and start. 100%.
Awesome. Okay, on to the next question. Just so you two are aware, we actually have a fair amount of questions and we are running out of time. So as short and sweet as we can make some of our answers would be great, so we can try to get through a fair amount that have come in. Rapid fire questions. Hugh Ball has asked, what are some features non-mechanical that pro players have that any casual player could apply to improve? So maybe positioning, game knowledge. What are some things that, besides mechanical, that could maybe help you?
Decision making in the game. Knowing what the right thing to do at the right time, even if the other guy's got better aim, better reaction speed, if you put yourself in the better situation than him, you can win just because you put yourself there at the right time. And that can apply to League of Legends, any first-person shooter, every game. If you play it smart, and I think positioning is probably one of the big things. Positioning and then followed by like timing, learning how to analyze your opponent in the moment and look at how they're playing, and going from there, you can outplay people even if your aim is much worse or your reactions or I don't know, slower or something like that. Yeah.
Someone I spoke to very, very recently, earlier today, actually, I was talking about when it comes to using mechanics like aim, right? That's a mechanic. It's something that you learn over time, something you reinforce. The difference is when you want to, people who are in that category of the best aimers subconsciously position themselves into areas where they're favored being able to out-aim their opponent, not just because they can move their mouse quicker and better and more accurate, but because they've put themselves in game in a position that favors them, and they need to do very little work to take out the other player. Positioning yourself in game, once you learn the game and the mechanics, the mechanics in the game of how to best position yourself. Same thing with League of Legends, ganks, a mid lane fight or something like that, or Dota or anything. And once you learn how to position yourself in the best possible way, then all of a sudden mechanics don't play much of a big deal.
All right, moving on to the next question. Jason has asked, do you do esports exclusively? So do you play, manage and coach exclusively, or do you also support yourself with other side jobs?
You'll start?
For me personally, you definitely do want to be in a position where you have a pretty significant role within the industry to be able to support yourself self-sufficiently. For me personally, I'm in a position where I can at the moment, but the current pandemic has made it difficult to add anything onto the side, which I probably would like to do at the same time. I like to treat gaming as something that I enjoy and something that I can dedicate a lot of time to, but I also like to have something else on the side so I don't go mad.
I would say myself as well, I'm always doing something else on the side. I think that also is just a fundamental thing you've got to do. It's kind of your backup. A lot of pro players will be in uni or have a part-time job. It's all about managing that balance. In Australia, unfortunately, there are very little positions where you are 100% full-time doing only esports. That's where we hope that over the next few years, there'll be more and more positions like that opening up. But yeah, I always do things on the side. A lot of people do that as well. It's very But doing things on the side, like I don't know if you put streaming as a separate thing. An esports pro player or coach or manager potentially might be a streamer as well on the side, though you could tie those two in together in a sense, though. It kind of
those sort of things help support. It will help support it, and plus you can still like, especially when it comes to streaming or making YouTube content or something like that, that will benefit your desire to continue to play professionally, because you can combine the two together. Whereas making bread at the bakery might not help you click on people better.
All right, moving on to the next question, also by Jason. What percentage of your day do you commit to practicing as a minimum, or what percentage would players in teams be committing?
In terms of percentage, I'm not sure. It also depends on like how competitive the game is and how serious the team wants to take it. If you're a team that's pushing for the top position, from my personal experience, not that I'm doing it at the moment, but that could always change. 3 hours would be minimum for a player on team. You'd be more comfortable with 4, and that's not just playing and practicing. That's analyzing yourself and doing extracurricular things. The more you play, the more experience you get, and the more it helps you. Unfortunately, that's just the case. For people that don't want to be playing all the time, all practice is good practice. So I would say, probably about 4 hours would be what you want to try and hit, especially if you're gunning for the top spots. If you're not, then it's lowers a little bit.
The way I look at it as well, from my previous experience as a player, now when I work with players, the thing that I try and hone into them, it's not necessarily always, you don't need to play a game 10 hours a day. But if you're scrimming for 4 and reviewing for 2, that's still 6 hours. That's still quite a lot of time. Now I'd say would be a high-level professional player. It's more about those good hours, right? They'll go and play ranked for an extra 2 hours, but the scrims and that review that they're doing as a team, that's the stuff where they learn and they actually get a lot better. But as you're saying, like, all practice is kind of good practice. The thing is you don't want to go mad and burn out. That's the big thing.
The efficiency of time spent is a point that I didn't really touch on there. Is if you spend 10 hours playing and all you're doing is playing, that's not as good as 4 hours where 2 of those you spent practicing and then the other 2 you spent looking over your mistakes. You can use less time if you use that time more efficiently.
Yep. Awesome. Okay. Twitchmain127 has asked an interesting question here. What's the potential future in terms of OCE and full-time esports players? At the current time, esports doesn't pay well. I'd like to know your opinions on the general economic future on esports and OCE.
Okay, that is a very good question. How do I touch on that?
It's a good one.
Oh, that's a great one. Time is the reality. We kind of are just 5 to 10 years behind North America, realistically. North America has had full-time players, let's say, efficient, past 4 or 5 years, I'd say, maybe a bit more than that, like really like that high-end full-time players making decent salaries or high salaries. The other thing that kind of comes into that is prize pools kind of, in a sense, like subsidize that gap as well. If there aren't those large prize pools, you kind of can't get that insane full-time potential. I realistically think it's a couple of years before it's a steady growth, and I would say 3 to 5 years still before you see a good, sustainable scene where you have a realistic, reliable income from it, unless something blows up like massively. But in our region, we're at least 3 to 5 years off, like across the board, top teams in the respective games all making a full-time living off just that professional team that they're with.
It sucks, but yeah, it's just the nature of things, and it's not just esports. Australia is fairly behind in many things in terms of sports, things like that. Just like in real sports, the goal is always to, if you want to make a career out of it, you're probably going to need to go international. If all you want to do is compete, that's a harsh reality, and it's a reality that's not going to really change much. Most people in other countries would probably feel the same. Even some areas of Europe, where America is, it's the golden land. It's the place where you make money. Some areas in Asia too are quite into certain kinds of games. I will mention that, yeah, the only game I can think of where playing exclusively in Australia can still net you a fair bit of money is Fortnite. I don't know that any, because they dish out a fair bit of money.
They dish out quite a lot of money. The thing is that is prize money, but also some popular players do make, like, it is like the top like 1 to 5 players that are making, I would assume, are making a decent amount off it.
And it's unreliable.
It's very unreliable and based on pricing, whereas salary is realistically where you're going to make the sustainable aspect of it. And that's kind of what I think prize money, like I always say, like, it kind of bridges the gap, but the reality is you want the sustainable side of it first before you want huge numbers of prizing. I think that question kind of needs,
and that's where
to it.
It does, but that's where the where we were early talking about building a profile for yourself is sort of it can help subsidize some of that stuff, like the more attractive you are, but because Americans love Australians, they really do. So building yourself up as a content, as someone that does content on the side, or someone that has a social media presence, can help you, like I said, help get your name out there more, and helps you branch into an international market easier than just consistently playing in Australia would. Because the other reality of the fact is that if you're winning all the Australian tournaments, there's still very much a consensus for most games that Australians can't cut it on the international stage. So you really need to do more than that. You need to get yourself out there as much as you can to get a chance at approaching something at an international level.
Okay.
If that skimmed the surface of that question.
Yeah, it's a very big question and we are running out of time, so we will move on. Jono has asked, how did you deal with different people's egos when you reach the higher levels in competitions? There are definitely egos when you get higher, so yeah, how do you deal with those?
Big time. Part of that comes down to making sure that making sure you surround yourself with the right kinds of people. The simple fact is egos are going to be there, and they're always going to have them. It tends to be more the younger people that have the big egos because they haven't been humbled yet. In terms of avoiding them, they're always going to be there, and you're always going to have to interact with them. But you, at the end of the day, you choose who you play with, and you choose how to behave yourself and how to behave around other people. That's the kind of thing that I was talking about when it came to, like, both Daniel and I were talking about when it came to red flags. Is you have to look at somebody, no matter how good they are, like how manageable are they on a team, like how much can you stand playing with this person, and how much can the organization stand. There are players that organizations will specifically avoid just because of their attitude. Doesn't matter how good they are, which is just so ridiculous, because it's just like, just stop it, just grow up a bit.
Ego, the way I look at it is, ego will bite people in the butt eventually. It doesn't always happen immediately, but eventually it will come around and bite them. Whether that's from an organization removing them, it can also be from a tournament organizer if they're going around saying all these things publicly, oh, I'm the best, or something like that. It can definitely affect them. It might not always happen immediately, and that all depends on organization and their perspectives on how they run things. But yeah, it is difficult. Some organizations will just remove people with egos. So be careful if you have an ego and aren't humbled. You could lose your spot potentially if they just don't want to put up with it potentially.
And the thing is, the more esports starts to be treated as a profession, which over the recent years it has been, the less egos will be tolerated. The same thing as is in real sports. Egos are out there, absolutely, but it's easier for them to run wild when there aren't rules and things like that to stop them, and just say, you got to chill. Like, you have to be a marketable person. You have to abide by these rules. Unfortunately, you're going to run into them in esports. There's no avoiding it, just like in real sports. But recognizing them and sort of like just keeping your distance, or like realizing which ones are worth it, which ones are worth putting up with for the sake of, your benefit, or which ones are just like avoid at all costs.
Yep. Okay, on to our next question. Hugh Ball has asked, how do you deal with tilt from both a management and player perspective?
Tilting is a weird one because just for people, I guess, to briefly summarize what tilting is, it's when you get frustrated, frustrate your performance, and then you proceed to perform worse the more frustrated you get. In terms of dealing with tilt, I think every player is guilty of it at least once, in usually more often than that. Personally, from my experience, tilting, which I'm not going to lie, it's still something that affects me from time to time, but it's something that I got over as I got older, and as I realized, that it's just simply not how it works. Managing your expectations, like sometimes you have bad games. Everybody does it. The best player in the world has a bad game. Sometimes you have to accept that. You have to understand it, and then you have to analyze what you can. So you analyze what you can out of it, so you can say, okay, this is why this happened, and this is what I'm going to learn from it, so I don't do that in the future. And that's part of that winning mindset. That what makes a great player is someone that can accept failure, and they can look at it to build themselves up and be a better player in the future.
Sort of something that I talk to players every now and again in the past, sometimes quite regularly. Player psychology is a huge part of a team, and to start with it, you sit down and talk with them, right? You sit down and talk with them. Why are they tilting? What's affecting them? What mentally is resulting in their lack of performance or something like that? And then trying to work through with them a way to manage, prevent, or just deal with it in whatever way that's best. That in of itself could be a whole topic. I think the very simple thing is management will usually try and sit down and talk with them and try and help them work through it. And the next thing above that is player psychologists is the next thing above that eventually you'll start to see come in. But yeah, just walking them through potential methods like breathing exercises, things like that, legitimately can help with things like that.
They sound ridiculous because it's like, oh, breathing exercise. Are you serious? Like, why don't I just snap out of it? It's about controlling aspects of your body and your mind that you're incapable of controlling. Otherwise, you wouldn't be tilting in the first place. Just like ways to sort of relax yourself, mindsets to put yourself in, so that you're in the future you're not going to make the same mistake that you did that led you to get into this tilting mindset where, you perform worse, nobody wins, you get frustrated, that sort of thing.
Work with the player is the way I like to put it. You work with the player and try and help them through it. That's the best I can say for it now.
All right, on to the next question. Twitch Main 127 has asked, what's something you wish someone told you before you got into the scene?
A big one for me, take all the opportunities you can get. There were times when I just started playing with Tempo Storm in Overwatch, and I had been offered to do some media stuff, just post some things like that for them, so guides and things like that. My mindset at the time, I still remember it, because I was I don't want to do that. That's a pain. I don't want to do that. I'd rather just play and things like that. So you begrudgingly say, I don't, like, realistically, I should have said, I'll do it. I'll give it to you by today. Can I please have more? Because that right there is them going, here you go. Here's this on a plate. Here's some recognition. You can use our platform to put you as a significantly sized international team to put yourself out there as an Australian player that might not get a lot of these chances. And I looked at it as if like, oh, that's just more work. These are the things you have to do. You have to treat it like a job. Every opportunity you can get, whether it be paid, whether it be unpaid, if it helps you and it puts your name out there, take it.
I definitely would agree with that point. I learned that reasonably early on, and I wish as well I'd just known even earlier how important that was, because then I spent so much time learning everything else about social media presence and everything around that. Something specific to me, I don't really know, how hard it was going to be. That would do one thing. And I think that taking every opportunity in a different aspect for myself, I think I would have to agree with taking absolutely every opportunity you can and make sure you're putting yourself out there more early on, I think would be something I wish I'd known a little bit earlier on as well. Just because it would have helped with progression just faster, because you've got to learn that in the first place. And if you go in knowing that, you kind of skip a few learning steps, which is always helpful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. On to the next question. Hueball has asked, how do you feel about betting in esports, particularly given its younger viewership?
Personally, I'd rather it didn't exist. I understand that whether there is a financial incentive for it to exist, that's something that's well above my pay grade. So I can't really talk about the semantics of what it does, because as far as I know, betting in traditional sports is a huge part of what helps its viewership. So, if betting builds the viewership, because I remember when Counter-Strike had a very popular betting scene, the viewership was a lot higher as a result, because it's it's something else to put on your game to make it more interesting to watch, just like it would in traditional sports. In terms of gaming, the simple fact is that gaming is open to kids, and much like the loot boxes and microtransactions and things like that, it does end up being quite predatory for children that don't really know what they're getting themselves into. I wouldn't be comfortable with it personally myself, despite the fact that, like, reasonably, if there were a way to stop kids from getting involved, like, under 18s can't do it, then I wouldn't have a problem with it. But it seems like people are struggling to find a way I don't know how how cyber law works in that regard, but yeah, as long as the kids aren't touching it, I don't see why it's a problem. But given the fact that right now kids can get involved, then it's a huge problem.
I think very specifically the problem is the age people get into it, and the ease of access is the problem. I think that's where the restrictions need to be very much lifted, managed, watched, everything about that. The reality at the end of the day, even though I'm not a fan of betting at all myself, at the end of the day, it does play a major part in scenes existing and being able to run. You look at traditional sporting, the amount of money that exists in betting, the reality is there's so much money, it makes other stuff work. In esports, it is a bit similar. You've got so much money going through the betting side of things that it kind of funds and makes things possible. I don't want to go into too much detail about it. It kind of it has to exist in some regard. I wish it didn't, personally. The biggest thing I see as a problem immediately with it is that whole age thing and ease of access to it. It's too easy to get into it. And that's what needs to be looked at mostly and honestly as soon as possible, because CSGO betting with skins and things like that, that's just, you have to have the game and you basically can start with very little knowledge at all. And I think more people becoming younger and computer literate earlier on means that they are going to find a way in, even if they lift restrictions a little bit. It's a tough job and very difficult to solve that problem. And I think that's something people need to be working on it. And there are people out there that are working on trying to improve and keep children safe and away from things where, it could have a real effect on their life.
All right. We're almost going to end. We are getting to cut off time, but there's a couple more questions. We'll see if we can fit them in. Phantom Gasher has asked, what do you do if your family doesn't really support you that much?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a hard question, but it's a great question. Personally, from my experience, my parents were very unsupportive of me choosing to pursue gaming. Perhaps rightly so, in the sense that you can't always get to where you want to go, things like that. But when I was 10 years old playing on my Nintendo all the time, competitive gaming didn't exist, so they saw it as a waste of time. Once it became clear that, hey, I was making money off of this and I was pretty good at it, then that's when Dad started busting out the, I helped you get good at Quake, that sort of thing. In terms of if your parents don't support you, my parents had a pretty quick turnaround. The moment I started doing it, gee, that's rough. Because now you're getting into the psychology of a family, and I mean every family is different, right? Without sort of sitting them down and showing them and saying, okay, there is a reason as to why I'm doing this. I think because parents do still want what's best for you at the end of the day, and they think this is not what's best for you. If you can show that you are doing something, and this is just a guess because I'm not a parent, but if you can show that you're doing something as well, that you have a backup plan, or that you have two plans of attack, so you have one for esports and then you have another one, it's a lot easier for a parent to look at what their child is doing and not feel so worried that they're getting themselves involved into something where they might not get anywhere.
I think the biggest thing is talking and explaining and looking at why do they think that, right? Are you sitting down and playing video games 10 hours a day and not handing your assignments in, failing grades at school, things like that? They're very easily going to see that as a waste immediately. And they do want what's best for you. So you've got to kind of make sure you're balancing things in the right way, in a healthy way first, then go and have that discussion. Like, talk to them about it, like, what are their expectations from you? And then go from there and say, okay, I really want to pursue this as a career, as a, high level hobby or whatever you want to call it. But they'll have expectations of you as well, that you'll need to work around realistically. I definitely know what it's like to be there. I think the big thing is you've got to try and have the discussion as kind of potentially awkward as that is, in a sense. Yeah, it's difficult. That's tough. That's genuinely tough.
All right, our last question for the evening. We've made it. Graham has asked, coaches and managers costs. It is a job for them too. What can you make as a coach or a manager?
Depends what level you're at. And in Australia, doing it full time, there's not many people at all doing it. Nobody's making in Australia that I'm aware of the big bucks, is what I'd like to call it. A lot of people are working on the side to make ends meet and to get by. If you look at North America, you could potentially be looking at people with amazing salaries. Look at Overwatch League and the expectations on them. It really comes down to what you're required to do to how much you'll get back. If you're required to travel internationally and work overseas, you're going to look at that's a situation where you'll probably expect somebody to be making something that's more reasonable and livable. Coaches as well, it really comes down to the tier of team you're working with. I think at the top level in Australia, usually the thing is people are investing more time than the return that they're getting, realistically. Most coaches and managers are usually quite passionate about what they're doing, and they'll potentially be investing all of their time in because they enjoy and they have a passion for it, not necessarily for the huge paycheck at the end of the day.
The other thing to consider,
really touching that.
Yeah, the other thing to consider is esports is still very young, extremely young, and coaching for esports is even younger than esports itself. So it's in a very young and misunderstood role that people have. The thing about coaching is it's something that will, in my opinion, I think it will become more recognized later on as people realize, and as esports becomes more mature and the professionalism gets even higher, the value of a coach all of a sudden becomes much higher than it is right now, because esports started out with just, oh, these guys are the best at this game, let's go watch them, things like that. And now it's getting onto this more sports like oriented thing where you realize that, okay, maybe these 5 people need someone as an overhead that can look at what they're doing and say, this is what you should be doing. Take the decision making and the thought process of the overarching game away from the players so they can just focus on what they want to do. This is something that's still very new. So I think coaching is something, despite the fact that there's not a lot of money to be made in it at the moment, I would say that coaching is a fairly worthwhile role to look at pushing yourself for the future, just because of the fact that it's very underrepresented at the moment, and with the direction esports is heading, coaches will all of a sudden become a lot more desired. That's my opinion.
One coach at the moment is the way I look at it. A lot of teams have one coach. In the future, you're going to start seeing 2 to 3 coaches on a team at the higher level. There will be, like, eventually when a game's potentially more figured out and things like that, and as we learn how to work in an emerging environment, you're going to see coaches start to get paid a lot more, because there's going to be a lot more expectation on their understanding of a game. Unfortunately, in our region, it's not quite there yet, but as I was saying before on the question about where we're at in terms of developing as a scene, we are a couple of years still away from that level.
Awesome. Okay, well, we will end it there this evening. So thank you, everyone who's been here in our webinar this evening. Thank you to our guests, Daniel and Jackson, for their insights and knowledge you have shared this evening. If you would like to keep up to date with what is happening from both of them in the world of esports, both of their Twitters are there. You can see Daniel's is at Dr_Nutter on Twitter, and Jackson's is at I'm not Katie. And if you follow Jackson, you will see that he has a Twitch as well, so you can see his streams and his gameplay and some of the coaching he's been doing recently as well. So thank you, Daniel and Jackson, both for your time this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and everybody who has been here this evening, thank you so much for coming to this webinar on becoming an esports competitor. Thank you to the Palmerston Council and the Australian Esports League, for without either of them, tonight would not have happened. I hope you found it beneficial and perhaps learned something new this evening in the world of esports. Now, we do have a form for feedback, so if you would like to give us your feedback, it shouldn't take you too long, maybe only a couple of minutes. We'd love to find out from you how you felt this webinar was, and we do appreciate that feedback. But thank you to everyone, and good night.